Hey, good afternoon, everybody. The last clip that I did was about, a little bit about my father's side of the family. And I'll go more in depth with that, but I want to kind of like balance out the conversation, not, giving more to one side because I think that'll just be exhausting. It doesn't give it nuance. I think just for doing it right, I'll talk about my mother's side and I'll go back and forth with each one from a longitudinal part of history. With my mom's side, this is a very interesting part of my family because I would say that most of my influences growing up has come from my mother's side of the family. My mom's side of the family can trace its ancestry back to Virginia, back in the days of slavery. And I'll use a specific date of, a specific year of 1834. My family were house slaves. Our family history goes that we were house slaves in Virginia, and we were bought by a man named B.F. Hammond. B.F. Hammond was also related to the Batts family that came out of Virginia, but we were bought by this man and bought to Texas. B.F. Hammond just so happens to be my fourth great grandfather. He's my fourth great grandfather because he had a daughter with an enslaved woman, and that enslaved woman got with the Batts family man, who would be my great 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 grandfather. And eventually, after slavery ended in Texas, because if you know anything about slavery in the state of Texas, it ended here last. So there was a move in Texas to actually give black people land, and my family just so happened to get that land. So there's an area of Texas called Hammond, Texas, where my family owns the entire thing. We actually sold part of it to Baylor University a couple of years ago. That part of my family is very much so what you would call an uppity type of part of my family. They were always called the bougie Bats because, they're very much so, very educated black people. Education has always been pushed on that side of the family. And that's just who we are. It's just a very educated group of black people who really did not allow a lot of things to stop them from making it in life. I'm not the first USC graduate in my family because there were other USC graduates. I was not the first one to go to Morehouse because there were other Morehouse graduates in the family. Where it starts to break down because keep in mind, that's like Northeast Texas, right? So then my great grandmother, eventually her part of the family, which is a mix of that North Texas family and a mix that's now coming out of Southern Louisiana, they're getting together and they create a family. And they're still along the same line. So the Gillies, well, we say Gillis, but the proper pronunciation is Gilly. Though that family gets with the Batts family, they start to have children, and it's still, kind of like it's a Creole mix, and it's also a Texas Virginia mix coming together. And it gets interesting because that great grandmother, who is my great grandmother, then marries down. And if you understand what marrying down means, that means that, you've gone from a certain class level in our community to another one. And it was not the right type of mix. On this part of the family, it is noted that, my great grandmother went through a lot of domestic violence, a lot of abuse. There was a lot of abuse in front of her children. And this is like by family accounts, like listening to older great cousins and people like that who could recall this time period. My great grandmother was abused. And not only was she abused, your children are witnessing you getting the abuse, and the children are also getting abused too. And because we are in the country at this point, you're looking at people who had children, not necessarily because they wanted children, but because you're in an agricultural society where the more children you have, the more people can work the field. So there's not much love being put into these children. There is more so, these are my kids, I'm going to use them and do what they have to do. That would be my great grandfather, who was the person that she married down to. This great grandfather, if you look at his side of the family, there was also a lot of domestic violence and abuse on his part of the family too. And that is something that a lot of people may look at and say, well, how is it that all this abuse goes on? And a lot of people, like, if you're looking at it from a black lens, will say that we're abusing our own. And I am of the agreement that yes, we are abusing our own, but we have to look at what's deeper beneath the surface. Okay, if these are my great grandparents, they are probably 2 to 3 generations removed from slavery. Okay, and it brings to the question, how do you know how to be a man or a woman if all of your dignity had been snatched from you? If all of your dignity had been snatched from you, if your people, when they were brought here, were stripped of all of their humanity and everything that made them people, that you didn't know how to raise a child, you know how to raise other people's child, but you had an inferiority complex because of the way you were taught to be. And all of a sudden it manifests itself in the way that you have your children. It manifests itself in their issues that they then have with their children. I have an aunt who openly calls her daughter a bitch. I find that disturbing. But she had to learn it from somewhere, as disturbing as that is. In my own family, my grandmother was in a shotgun wedding. She got a shotgun wedding. So if you don't know what a shotgun wedding is, let's just say after you look it up and the initial shock is gone, understand that happened with that was my grandmother. My grandmother got pregnant in her early teens or her late teens. And the man who got her pregnant, my grandfather, was forced to marry her at gunpoint. And they stayed together and they had children. And that eventually ended in divorce. And that was also messy. And it kind of matriculated down to my mother. And there was a lot of issues. She had mixed feelings towards her mother and mixed feelings towards her father. She then also married and entered a relationship that was not the best. And she was cheated on by the husband. She then in return stayed in the marriage and cheated on him and produced 3 children, as opposed to walking away from a man that clearly didn't make you happy. You wanted to make him miserable, and misery followed. So my mother had tragic relationships in her life. I don't think she was ever happy in love while she was on this side of the soil. She did not find a man that truly respected her. My father, not being this man, but one of the men that she cheated on her husband with, my father was not too much of a man himself. If you listen to the other story, what I was saying, that, there was broken patterns of that family that then came into fruition with me and my mother. So if you're looking at all of these breakdowns in family, you're looking at a correlation of one part of the family that has access and wealth after a tumultuous period of life on both sides. And then you're also looking at the breakdown that's happening on both sides. So much so that even my sisters, we do not share the same father. And we were raised completely different from each other. So it's like, even though we grew up in the exact same house, we were not raised nor treated equally. And that was not just basically on the basis of gender, that was based on favoritism, because favoritism was something that also happened in the previous generation and the previous generation before that. And so now there's a generational transfer of favoritism that's happening within the household. That is very honest of me to come forward with that and be forthcoming. There's a lot that goes into that as far as colorism, because my sisters were lighter skinned. There was better treatment that was given to them. There was also treatment that wasn't necessarily good for me, because there's something about boys can't cry and boys can't be emotional, but yet I was stripped of a lot of that, not necessarily by my mother, but by the other generations. So then I started to see intergenerational conflict happening when I was a child. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm just going to recall that, this is like a family that has gone from the upper echelons of life and they've kind of gone down by the time it gets to me. There are land disputes in this part of the family. There are clashes between brothers and sisters within this. There's a need to resolve issues that can never be resolved because everyone has a sense of pride and no one wants to talk about it. Even between my mother and her siblings, they had a horrible relationship with each other. And it all starts with the dysfunction that happens in the family. But understand what I'm saying. Don't think about the dysfunction from a standpoint of they were just dysfunctional people. They were dysfunctional because of the institution of slavery in the South and generations of people who had to endure that exact same legacy of dehumanization. I'll close by saying this. If you read the book Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy Leary, she brings up an excellent point about during slavery, the mother would degrade her child in front of master. If the master came in front of that child and said, "Ooh, this child looks like, they're growing up really well, that child looks strong," that mother knew what was going to happen to her child. And she had to destroy that child in front of massa for two protective reasons. One, you're not taking my baby. Two, I don't need you to leave me for those types of reasons. And three, if I lose my child, I lose everything I have. And that is exactly what you find within the Black family today. You have a lot of dysfunction that is attached to generational trauma that people have yet to resolve, and many don't know where it comes from. So with that being said, I'm going to leave it at that. I'll come back on here on Saturday to talk about my father. Peace.